In an age of flying fortresses made of steel and aluminum, Britain's most elusive weapon was built from wood. They called it the Mosquito. How did an aircraft without a single defensive machine gun become a personal humiliation for Hermann Göring? This is a story not of technology, but of heresy, of how a handful of engineers, ridiculed in ministry offices, challenged the central dogma of war, declaring, "The best defense is not armor, but speed, and the best material for a weapon of the future could be a material from the distant past." We will tell the story of how the most fragile-looking concept broke through the thickest wall of prejudice, and how an airplane, built by cabinet makers and piano assemblers, became an argument that silenced the generals. The late 30s. The world held its breath, and that breath smelled of hot metal. The coming war already had a sound: the roar of steel mills, the shriek of rivet guns, the growing thunder of thousands of piston engines. It was a prelude to a symphony of destruction, and its score was written exclusively in the language of steel and aluminum. Military thinking, forged in armor, demanded more. More guns, more armor plate, more engines to lift all that weight into the air. And into this chorus of brute force, a quiet but confident voice broke through. Sir Geoffrey de Havilland. He and his closest colleagues, the brilliant designer Ronald Bishop and chief engineer Charles Walker, saw the coming battle differently. They saw not only strength, but also vulnerability. They understood that you couldn't cheat the laws of physics. Every pound of armor was a stolen mile of speed. Every defensive machine gun, with its turret and gunner, meant extra seconds on the way to the target. In the quiet of their design office, they nurtured an idea so bold it bordered on heresy. An idea born not from the brutality of military doctrine, but from the elegance of 1930s racing planes. A bomber, without a single machine gun. An airplane, built from wood. In the corridors of the Air Ministry, their concept was met first with bewilderment, and then with open laughter. Generals and officials, whose minds were cast in duralumin, listened to de Havilland as if he were a madman. Wood? In the age of all-metal fighters? That wasn't just a step backward. It was a leap into the past, to the days of biplanes and fabric wings. And to give up the gunners, that was pure suicide. But the trio from de Havilland was stubborn. Their logic was simple and deadly. Why carry heavy turrets if you could simply fly away? Their bomber was not meant to be a flying fortress, but a ghost, an elusive phantom that appears over the target and vanishes before enemy fighters can even scramble to intercept. Its armor would be speed. Its defense would be altitude. The construction was as radical as the idea. Not just planks, but a clever sandwich of birch plywood and the lightest balsa wood glued together under pressure. It was a technology more familiar to a cabinet maker or a piano craftsman than to an aircraft engineer of 1939. Time and again, they were rejected. The project was called de Havilland's Folly, a wooden toy. The Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, was especially fierce in his opposition. He needed thousands of Spitfires and Hurricanes, proven, reliable, metal fighters, not this chimera of plywood and glue, which was a distraction of resources and looked like a dangerous gamble. But the war was already raging in Europe. Britain was suffering losses, and at some point, when all official channels were exhausted, de Havilland got his way. It wasn't a triumph. It was a reluctant, grudging permission, granted more out of irritation than faith. All right, build it, but at your own expense, and only one. A single chance. A single prototype that would have to single-handedly battle the dogmas of an entire era, It was assigned the number W4050, and in the strictest secrecy, far from the factories and airfields, in the historic Salisbury Hall, a handful of engineers and carpenters began to craft their heresy of wood and glue. On their shoulders lay not just the fate of a project. On their shoulders lay the fate of an idea that could change the rules of air warfare. And prototype W4050 was their only fragile argument. And this was its cradle. Not a humming factory floor, not a huge government hangar. It was the historic Salisbury Hall, a place steeped in history, with its own moat and, according to rumor, its own ghosts, the perfect hideout for a project that was meant to become a ghost in the sky itself. Here, under the direction of Ronald Bishop, a kind of magic was being made. Forget the rivet guns and the screech of metal. The main sounds here were the whisper of planes, the quiet creak of clamps, and the thick, milky smell of cassane glue. Inside this quiet mansion, a handful of outcast geniuses were assembling a weapon of the future from a material of the past. It all began with giant concrete molds, like colossal cradles. In them, layer by layer, the DNA of the future aircraft was laid down. 3 layers of Canadian birch plywood, as thin as parchment, were interleaved with 2 layers of weightless balsa wood from Ecuador. This engineering masterpiece, this 7mm sandwich, was then covered with a rubber blanket, and, under pressure, saturated with glue, it took on a perfect aerodynamic shape. This is how the 2 halves of the fuselage were born. 2 elegant wooden shells. And here lay de Havilland's second, equally brilliant, heresy. Think of any other plane of that era. It's a cramped metal tube where workers, bent over in the dark, install miles of cables, pipes, and controls. A hellish, slow process. Bishop's team did it differently. They simply laid the 2 fuselage halves on trestles, like an open book, and in this open space, in broad daylight, they calmly and methodically installed everything. The control systems, the wiring, the hydraulics. It wasn't manufacturing. It was surgery. And when everything was in its place, the 2 halves were brought together. Like closing a precious jewel box. They were glued, strapped, and fastened with thousands of tiny brass screws. It was a revolution in assembly. Elegant and lethally efficient. But who could do such delicate work? The aircraft factories were overloaded. So de Havilland turned to those who knew the soul of wood best, to contractors that would have made the Ministry General's hair stand on end. Components for the fearsome new bomber were being made by furniture factories in High Wycombe, craftsmen whose hands were used to the curves of Chippendale chairs, piano makers who understood perfect acoustics and the resonance of wood, and even coffin makers whose craft demanded absolute precision and respect for the material. 50,000 individual wooden parts, each one carved, fitted, and glued with surgical precision. From this kit, this mosaic of wood and glue, a predator was born. The wings, built as a single piece, passed through the fuselage, providing unprecedented strength. 2 mighty Rolls-Royce Merlin engines were mounted in the nose. Slowly, in the quiet of the old estate, prototype W4052 took shape. It didn't look like a wooden toy. With its smooth, polished skin, without a single rivet to disturb the airflow, it looked alive, organic, deadly. The ghost of Salisbury Hall was ready. All that was left was to prove that it could fly. November 25th, 1940. The damp, chilly air of the airfield at Hatfield. The ghost of Salisbury Hall, this engineering masterpiece of wood and glue, stood in the open for the first time. Against the gray hangars in the muddy field, it looked like an alien. Too smooth, too perfect for this world of mud and steel. In the cockpit, sat a man for whom this flight was not just a job, it was a matter of honor. Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., the firm's chief test pilot and the founder's son. He carried on his shoulders not only the weight of prototype W4050, but the full weight of his father's dream, the full audacity of this wooden heresy. The two Merlin engines came to life with a deep, rumbling cough. The plane moved, lightly, almost weightlessly. The rubber shock absorbers, a simple and brilliant design, worked smoothly over the uneven field. And then, it was airborne. What de Havilland Jr. felt in those moments became the stuff of legend. The plane didn't fly, it danced, responsive, light, like a living extension of the pilot's thoughts. None of the inertia of heavy metal, none of the clumsiness of a flying fortress. It was pure energy, a predator that had thrown off its chains. The first flight was perfect, but it was only a prologue, a private triumph among friends. The real trial was yet to come, the place of judgment, the test center at Boscombe Down, a sanctuary of concrete and steel where military bureaucracy, with a ruler and a stopwatch, decided the fate of projects. All those who had laughed at the wooden toy were gathered here. Generals, ministry officials, test pilots whose hands were used to the cold metal of a Spitfire's controls. W4050 was rolled onto the runway. It looked like an outsider, almost defenseless, no machine guns, no armor. Its only argument was speed. And then it began. The acceleration, the takeoff, the climb. The plane shot into the icy blue of the February sky of 1941. On the ground, in the silence of the command post, the skeptics held their breath. They were waiting for the numbers. They knew the benchmark. The benchmark was the Spitfire Mark II, the pride of the nation, the best of the best. Its limit was just over 600 kilometers per hour. For a bomber to even approach that number would be a miracle. The Mosquito leveled off at its designated altitude. Its two Merlins sang their song at full power. The instrument needles settled, and over the radio, the dry, dispassionate voice of the test pilot read out the numbers. Silence fell in the room. Someone asked him to repeat it. The voice from the sky repeated the numbers. It couldn't be. An error with the instruments. A pilot error. An error in the atmosphere itself. 392 miles per hour. 631 kilometers per hour. It wasn't just fast. It was 30 kilometers per hour faster than a Spitfire. A bomber. A defenseless wooden bomber had just humiliated the pride of fighter command. It wouldn't just escape a chase. It would leave the pursuers far behind, choking on its exhaust fumes. On that day at Boscombe Down, a dogma died. The concept that had been mocked in offices was proven in the most brutal and irrefutable way. In the sky. The best defense wasn't to carry armor. The best defense was to simply not get caught. The laughter in the Air Ministry corridors was replaced first by stunned silence, then by feverish activity. Lord Beaverbrook, who had recently been a fierce opponent of the project, now demanded the wooden wonder for himself, and as many as possible. The skepticism had vanished. In its place came the realization. They had in their hands a weapon that could rewrite the rules of the game. An official's pen touched paper. The first official order for 50 aircraft was signed. The ghost of Salisbury Hall was no longer a heresy. It was becoming a legend. The ink on that first order was barely dry, but the legend was already demanding to be made real, in series, in mass numbers. The ghost of Salisbury Hall had to become an army of ghosts, and the first to enter the battlefield were those who took de Havilland's idea to its absolute extreme. They weren't just without armor. They were without a single gun. This was the first photo reconnaissance squadron based at RAF Benson. In mid-1941, they received their first production machines, the PR Mark I. Painted in a special pale blue that blended with the high-altitude sky, they were the purest expression of speed. Their only weapons were 5 cameras in the belly. Their only defense was altitude and audacity. Every mission was like a defiant act against the entire military machine of the Third Reich. While down below, in the gray haze, Luftwaffe fighters waited for armadas of heavy bombers, the Mosquito appeared where it was not expected. It glided at an altitude of 11 kilometers, in the icy, thin blue where neither fighters nor anti-aircraft guns could reach. The pilot saw all of Europe below him like a map. Brest, Bordeaux, the shipyards of Kiel. One click of the shutter, and the enemy's secrets were turned into ghostly negatives on film. Early German radars, tuned to detect massive metal targets, sometimes simply failed to notice the wooden airframe. And when they did, it was too late. Interceptors would scramble into the sky, but their pilots would only see a thin white contrail disappearing to the west, a trail of pure mockery. This was not a battle. It was a humiliation. The wooden wonder had become Britain's elusive eye, and that eye saw everything. But when the sun set and the all-seeing reconnaissance planes returned to their bases, another war began in the skies of Europe. A war of shadows. Hundreds of Luftwaffe bombers headed for the cities of England under the cover of night. And here, in this coal-black darkness where speed was useless, a different kind of predator was needed. The night fighter, the NF Mark II, took the stage. The same elegant airframe, but now painted a matte black that devoured light. Its wooden nose no longer had glass for a bombardier. Its nose was solid, and in it beat a new, unseen heart, an AI Mark IV radar. Now the crew consisted of 2 hunters, the pilot, whose hands were on the controls, and the radar operator, hunched over a small screen with a sweeping green line. This was their guide in the starless void, and among these night hunters was one whose name became synonymous with terror for Luftwaffe pilots, John Cunningham. Propaganda dubbed him Cat's Eyes, assuring the public that he could see in the dark thanks to a special carrot diet. The truth was far more technological and frightening. Cunningham didn't just see the radar, he felt it. He read those ghostly green blips like an open book. Imagine the scene. Darkness, the cold of the cockpit. The only sound is the steady hum of the 2 Merlins. And suddenly, the calm voice of the operator comes through the headphones. Contact, to the right, 3 miles, 1,000 feet above. Cunningham smoothly banked the plane. No sudden movements. He was a shadow, stalking another shadow. The green blip on the screen grew brighter. 2 miles, 1 mile. And then, when the radar was almost screaming of the proximity, Cunningham would look up, and he would see them. Tiny tongues of flame from the exhaust pipes of a Heinkel or a Dornier. He didn't attack from behind. That was too easy. He came from below, from the blind spot where the gunners weren't looking. He would creep in so close he could have seen the rivets on the enemy's fuselage, if there had been any. And then, a short, furious press of the trigger. 4 20mm cannons and 4 machine guns in the nose spat out a wall of fire. A 1-second burst would tear the enemy plane to pieces. A short, violent flash in the darkness, and then silence again. So, night after night, the mosquitoes cleansed the skies of Britain. The number of kills grew exponentially. Tens, hundreds. This engineering masterpiece, born as an unarmed racer, had become the most effective night killer in the Royal Air Force's arsenal. It had proven it could be an invisible eye, Now it proved it could also be a merciless fang. But its greatest role, the one that would forever write its name in history, was still to come. The role of a surgeon, striking at the very heart of the enemy. To be the eye in the fang is one thing. To be the scalpel is another entirely. For that, you need more than just speed or firepower. You need audacity bordering on madness, and you need pilots capable of directing that audacity to a single point on the enemy's map. September 25th, 1942. 4B Mark IV bombers from the 105 Squadron are racing over the waves of the North Sea. Their target is Oslo, or more precisely, one specific building in its heart, the Gestapo headquarters at Victoria Terrasse. This isn't a carpet bombing raid. This is an execution, precise, calculated, and public. They flew at treetop level, so low that Norwegian farmers in the fields only had time to look up at the roar of the Merlins and see the fleeting silhouette of a British plane. No warning, no chance for interceptors. Bursting into the city, the Mosquitoes became ghosts, gliding between church spires. 4 bombs with an 11-second delay were placed precisely on target. For the Gestapo, it was a shock. For occupied Norway, it was a thunderous message. We are here. We see you. And we can get you anywhere. This was the first test, brutal and effective. But the true masterpiece of psychological warfare was yet to come. January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of the Nazis' rise to power. All of Germany is glued to their radios. The smug, pompous speech of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring fills the airwaves. He speaks of the Reich's invincible might, of total control over the skies of Europe. And at that very moment, over Berlin, brazenly, in broad daylight, 3 Mosquitoes appear. They are not expected. They are not supposed to be there. And their bombs fall directly on the radio station from which the broadcast is being transmitted. Göring's speech is cut off mid-sentence. On the air, the roar of an explosion, then a deafening silence, followed by the crackle of static. Millions of Germans hear it. This is not just an explosion. It's a puncture in the bloated bubble of Nazi self-confidence, delivered by a ghost of wood and glue. The humiliation was so complete that Göring himself would later confess in frustration. It makes me jealous when I see the Mosquito. The British have geniuses, and we have nothing but duds. They proved they could execute. They proved they could humiliate. But now they had to do the nearly impossible, to rescue. February 1944. The prison in Amiens. Behind its thick walls, hundreds of French resistance fighters await execution. Intelligence reports the date is set for February 19th. There is no time. Any attempt at a ground assault is certain death for the prisoners. Only one insane, desperate chance remains. Operation Jericho. 19 FB Mark VI fighter bombers, led by Group Captain Percy Pickard, take to the air. Their mission sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. Flying at an altitude of just a few meters, they must breach the outer prison wall and the wall of the dining hall, where the guards will be gathered at lunchtime. Not to destroy the prison, not to kill the inmates, but to surgically break open the stone box, giving the people inside a chance to escape. The bombs must hit the wall at a height of exactly 3 meters. Any lower, and they won't breach it. Any higher, and they'll collapse the floors, burying everyone under the rubble. It was flying on a razor's edge. The first wave attacks. The roar of engines mixes with screams on the ground. Through the smoke and dust, the pilots see a gaping hole in the outer wall. Success. The second wave hits the guards' building. Success. A stream of people pours out of the breaches to freedom. Hundreds of lives saved. But this victory came at a price. On the way back, the commander's plane, Percy Pickard's, was attacked by German fighters. The man who planned and led this incredible operation did not return to base. Recon plane, night killer, surgeon. The Mosquito became everything. For occupied Europe, its roaring merlins became the sound of hope. And for the enemy, a reminder that even in the darkest sky, there is always room for a ghost that flies faster than fear. After the precision strikes and daring raids that were whispered about across Europe, the inevitable happened. The demand became insatiable. The legend required an assembly line. But how do you mass-produce a miracle born in a secluded mansion? How do you turn a unique work of art into a weapon of mass destruction? The answer was a concept unthinkable for traditional aircraft manufacturing. Production was decentralized. It went underground, into the shadows. The Mosquito's blueprints were sent not to giant aircraft plants, but to places that knew how to work with wood, to furniture factories, to piano assemblers, to cabinet makers. Suddenly, quiet workshops that had been creating elegant chests of drawers were now carving wing ribs for the fastest plane in the world. And this wooden empire expanded rapidly, crossing oceans. In Downsview, Canada, and Bankstown, Australia, far from German bombs, new centers of power arose. Thousands of miles from England, people who had never seen the skies of Europe were building ghosts for its battles. Canadian birch, Australian eucalyptus. The Mosquito absorbed the strength of the entire Commonwealth. But just when it seemed this engineering masterpiece was invincible, it revealed its Achilles heel. In the humid, moisture-soaked climate of Burma, in the fight against Japan, something terrible began to happen to the planes. The skin would ripple. The wooden skin would peel away from the frame. The cause was microscopic and deadly. The casein glue, which worked perfectly in Europe, turned into a useless paste in the tropics, devoured by fungus and moisture. The wooden wonder was rotting alive. The solution came from the laboratories. A new compound, urea formaldehyde aerolite 303, was impervious to moisture. Production around the world was retooled on the fly. The wooden empire strengthened its bonds, becoming even stronger. And this strength was needed to repel a new, soulless threat. In the summer of 1944, hell was unleashed on southern England. V-1 flying bombs. They were called buzz bombs. They flew without pilots, without a specific target, bringing only chaos and death. To fight this mechanical swarm of insects, a special hunter was needed, and that hunter was the Mosquito. It was a strange hunt. The pilots would fly so close to a V-1 they could see the primitive welding on its fuselage. Shooting it down was dangerous. The warhead's explosion could destroy the fighter as well. So they devised a trick that required nerves of steel and pinpoint precision. The Mossy would approach the rocket from the side, carefully slide its wing under the V-1's wing, and with a gentle nudge, tip its gyroscope. Thrown off balance, the V-1 would tumble and plummet to the ground, exploding in an empty field. 600 times, Mosquito pilots performed this deadly aerial ballet. But the most incredible role for this aircraft was not in combat. It was hidden under the guise of a civilian flight. The British airline BOAC organized a daring air bridge to neutral Sweden. Unarmed Mosquitoes, painted in civilian colors, would take off from airfields in Scotland and race at top speed over the North Sea. Their cargo was more precious than gold, Swedish ball bearings, vital for the entire Allied war machine. And one day, in the bomb bay of such a courier, lay the most precious cargo in history. A man. His name was Niels Bohr, the great physicist, father of quantum theory, who had fled from occupied Denmark. Crouched in the cramped, unpressurized compartment on a makeshift bench, he held the keys to the atomic weapon. The entire protection for this man, whose knowledge could decide the outcome of the war, was the speed of a wooden airplane flying faster than enemy interceptors. The plane created by the genius of a few was saving the genius who could change the world. And that, perhaps, was its greatest, unspoken mission. When the thunder of guns began to fade and the smoke over the ruins of European cities began to clear, the time for a ruthless audit arrived. War is not just about battles. It's also a merciless accounting, where every machine, every life, every mission is entered into the grand ledger of history. And in the main ledger of the Royal Air Force, in the losses column, next to the name Mosquito, stood a number that seemed like a typo, 0.66%. For every 1,000 sorties, this wooden ghost lost only 6 aircraft. It was the lowest rate of any Allied bomber, a statistic written in blood that proved its creators right more loudly than any words. Speed is the best armor. But the paradox was that by the end of the war, when the outcome was already decided, the Mosquito did not rest. It evolved into its most ferocious forms. This was no longer a scalpel. It was a sledgehammer. Meet the FB MK-XT8 modification, nickname Tsetse. In the nose of this predator, instead of machine guns and cameras, engineers installed a 6-pounder, 57mm Mollins gun, essentially a lightened anti-tank cannon. Its targets were not Gestapo headquarters or radio stations. Its prey was the steel backs of Kriegsmarine U-boats surfacing to recharge in the Bay of Biscay. Each shot from this monster sent 25 armor-piercing shells at the target. The wooden fighter had become a hunter of steel wolves. But even that was not the limit. Engineers took the plane that the press still called the Wooden Wonder and hung a 4,000-pound cookie bomb in its belly. A single bomb, capable of flattening an entire city block like a house of cards. The wooden structure, designed for speed, proved to be so strong that it could withstand a weight that not even the creators of 4-engine giants had planned for. And here, against this backdrop of ultimate power, it is worth remembering the man who felt it most acutely. After that humiliating silence on the radio, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, the creator of the Luftwaffe, uttered a phrase in frustration that became an epitaph for his Air Force and a crown for the Mosquito. It makes me damned jealous when I see the Mosquito. The British, they have geniuses, and we have nothing but duds. It was a confession. The complete, unconditional defeat of a rigid system obsessed with metal and brute force in the face of elegant and daring simplicity. The war ended. But legends don't retire. They just change uniforms. And the de Havilland engineers decided to throw down one last, most audacious challenge, to land the wooden bird on the steel deck of an aircraft carrier. Thus, the Sea Mosquito was born. With folding wings, an arrestor hook, and reinforced landing gear, it proved that this brilliant airframe could conquer the sea as well. Production was halted in 1950, with the final count at 7,781. It served longer than many of its all-metal contemporaries, becoming the last echo of an era when wood took to the sky. Recon plane, fighter, bomber, hunter, courier. It was not just an airplane. It was a refutation. Proof that the genius of design can turn back time and find in a forgotten past a weapon capable of defining the future. The story of the Mosquito is not just a tale about a wooden plane. It's a parable about how a seemingly fragile idea proved stronger than armored dogma, proving that in the race of technology, the winner is not the one who builds up muscle, but the one who changes the rules of the race itself. How many other wooden wonders, bold, simple, and brilliant solutions do we dismiss today, simply because they aren't cast in the metal we're used to? And where is that fine line that separates insane heresy from prophetic genius? What do you think? Let us know in the comments, because it is in dialogues like these that truth is born. If this story made you think, support us with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters in the Book of Great Ideas.